I rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere in rural West Virginia with my girlfriend, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, with only one narrow dirt road leading in and out of the property. There was no cell service once we turned off the main road. No nearby houses, no passing traffic, just trees on both sides of the road the entire way in. The listing made it sound like a quiet weekend spot, which is exactly what we wanted. Something cheap, isolated, and away from everything. The last 10 minutes of the drive were slow because the dirt road narrowed and dipped in places, with branches hanging low over the truck. When we finally reached the cabin, it sat in a small clearing with nothing but woods behind it and the same dirt road stretching back out the way we came. It was a small wooden cabin with a front porch, one main room, a short hallway, and a bedroom in the back. Nothing fancy, but it looked usable. The kind of place you'd expect to be a little worn down, but still fine for a couple of nights. We brought our bags inside, checked the place quickly, and noticed right away how quiet it was. No insects, no distant traffic, nothing. Just the cabin settling and the wind moving through the trees. I remember saying something about how quiet it felt, and my girlfriend just nodded and kept unpacking. We didn't do much that evening. We had brought food, so we cooked something simple in the kitchen and sat at the small table near the front window. The light outside faded pretty fast once the sun dropped behind the tree line, and the woods around the cabin turned into a solid wall of black. At one point, I stepped out onto the front porch just to look around. The dirt road was barely visible in the dark, and beyond the edge of the clearing, everything disappeared into the trees. There were no lights anywhere. No houses in the distance, no headlights, nothing. I went back inside and locked the cabin door out of habit. It wasn't something I thought about much at the time, just a routine thing you do before settling in for the night. Later on, we were sitting on the couch, talking and scrolling through our phones even though there was no signal. Just out of habit. That's when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just the sound of something moving near the edge of the clearing, somewhere between the cabin and the tree line. It stopped almost as soon as I noticed it. I paused for a second, listening, but didn't hear anything else. Probably just an animal, I said, more to fill the silence than anything. She asked what I heard, and I told her it was nothing. We both kind of left it at that. A little while later, I heard it again. This time closer, not in the woods, but on the dirt road in front of the cabin. It sounded like something shifting on gravel, a slow, deliberate kind of movement, not quick like an animal running through. It lasted a few seconds, then stopped again. I stood up and walked toward the front window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look out. There was nothing there, just the empty dirt road and the edge of the trees. I stayed there for a few seconds, scanning the road, but nothing moved. When I sat back down, I told her it was probably a deer or something crossing the road. She didn't respond right away, just kept looking toward the door for a second before going back to her phone. We decided to go to bed earlier than planned. Neither of us said it out loud, but the cabin didn't feel as comfortable as it had when we arrived. Before turning off the lights, I checked the front door again, made sure it was locked, then checked the small window in the kitchen and the bedroom window in the back. Everything was closed and secured. The bedroom was simple, just a bed, a small nightstand, and one window facing the back of the property. When we turned off the light, the room went completely dark. At some point during the night, I woke up. I didn't know exactly what time it was, but the cabin was completely silent. No wind, no movement, nothing. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what woke me up. Then I heard it, a sound coming from outside the cabin, right near the front. It was subtle, but clear enough once I focused on it. Something moving on the dirt road again. Not fast, slow, like someone shifting their weight or taking careful steps on gravel. I stayed still, listening. The sound moved from one side of the front of the cabin to the other, then stopped. There was a long pause. Then it started again. This time it wasn't just on the road. It sounded closer to the cabin, closer to the front porch. I sat up slightly and looked toward the bedroom door, which was open just enough to see into the hallway. The cabin was dark, but I could make out the shape of the hallway leading toward the front door. The sound came again, heavier this time, like a foot pressing down on the wooden porch. One step, then another. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps crossed the length of the porch slowly, stopping near where the front door would be. There was a pause, then a soft sound at the door. Not a knock, more like a hand pressing against it, testing it. The handle didn't turn. The door didn't open. Just a slight pressure against it, then nothing. I heard my girlfriend shift next to me. She was awake now. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me in the dark. Neither of us said anything else. We just listened. A few seconds passed. Then we heard it again. The same slow steps on the porch, moving away from the door this time, back toward the edge of the cabin. Then the sound dropped off the porch, back onto the dirt. Then, silence. I don't know how long we stayed like that, just sitting there in the dark, listening for it to come back. After a while, I got out of bed and walked into the main room. I didn't turn on any lights. I just stood there near the front door, listening. Nothing. I looked through the front window again, pulling the curtain slightly. The dirt road was empty. The clearing was still. The tree line didn't move. I went back to the bedroom and told her it was probably nothing, even though neither of us believed that. We didn't really sleep after that. After maybe 20 minutes, I said we should just leave. She agreed immediately. We got dressed quickly, grabbed our bags, and moved through the cabin without turning on the lights. I unlocked the front door and opened it slowly. The air outside was cold, and the clearing looked exactly the same as before. No one was there. We walked straight to the truck, got in, and I started the engine. The headlights lit up the dirt road in front of us, and that's when I saw it. The road was blocked. A few yards ahead, several thick tree trunks had been dragged across the dirt road, laid side by side, completely covering the path out. They weren't fallen trees. They were cut clean on both ends and placed across the road in a way that made it impossible to drive around them without going into the trees. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was looking at. Then my girlfriend said, "Those weren't there before." She was right. The road had been clear when we arrived. I put the truck in park and got out. Up close, it was even more obvious. The logs were too evenly placed, too deliberate. Someone had moved them there. I grabbed one of the smaller sections and tried to roll it, but it barely shifted. They were heavier than they looked. Behind me, I heard her open the passenger door and step out onto the dirt road. "We need to go," she said. I nodded, but there was nowhere to go unless we moved at least part of it. I tried again, putting more effort into it, managing to shift one log just enough to create a narrow gap on one side of the road. It wasn't enough to comfortably drive through, but maybe just enough if I angled the truck right. That's when I heard something to the right, not from the road, from the tree line. A step, then another, slow, steady, moving parallel to where we were standing. I stopped and looked toward the trees, but it was still too dark to see anything beyond the first few branches. The movement continued, matching our position on the road, just inside the woods, not approaching, not leaving, just moving alongside us. I didn't say anything. I just got back into the truck. She was already inside, door closed. I put it in drive and eased forward, lining up the truck with the small gap I'd made. As we passed the logs, I kept my eyes on the road, but I could still hear it. Steps in the woods, keeping pace. We cleared the logs and I accelerated without stopping. The dirt road stretched out ahead of us and the headlights bounced with the uneven ground. After a few seconds, the sound in the woods disappeared. I didn't slow down until we hit the main road. Neither of us said much after that. We didn't go back to the cabin. We didn't call anyone about it. We just drove until we reached a town and found somewhere else to stay. I kept thinking about those logs on the road, how long it would have taken to drag them there, and how close that person had been to the cabin while we were inside. I was parked in a remote area outside Moab, sleeping alone in my trailer in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road or established campsite. There were no other vehicles around when I pulled off. No lights in the distance, no signs of anyone else camping nearby. Just open land, scattered rock formations, and a flat stretch of dirt where I figured I could park for the night. I had been driving most of the day and didn't feel like pushing all the way back to town, so I turned off onto a wide dirt turnout I saw just off the main road. I drove out far enough that the road itself wasn't visible anymore, just to avoid any late traffic or headlights passing by. Once I parked the trailer, everything went quiet in a way that felt normal for that kind of place. No traffic, no voices, just wind moving across the open ground and occasionally brushing against the side of the trailer. I stepped out to stretch for a bit and looked around before going inside. The sky was clear and the stars were visible in a way you don't really get near cities. The ground around the trailer was flat, with patches of dirt and scattered rocks, and beyond that, it opened up into darker stretches of land with low ridges and rock formations. There was nothing out there that I could see. I went back into the trailer, locked the trailer door, and set up for the night. The inside was small but functional. A narrow bed, a small table, and a cabinet space near the front. I kept a flashlight within reach out of habit, especially when I was parked somewhere this isolated. I ate something simple, checked my phone even though there was no signal, then lay down on the bed. At first, it was quiet enough that I fell asleep pretty quickly. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up. It wasn't a loud noise that woke me. It was subtle enough that I wasn't even sure if I had actually heard something or just shifted in my sleep. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. Then I heard it again, a light knock. It came from the side of the trailer, somewhere near where the small table was. It wasn't loud, just a quick, dull sound against the outer wall. I stayed quiet, listening for it to repeat, but nothing came after. I told myself it was probably just the wind pushing something loose against the side of the trailer. Maybe a small rock or debris shifting around. After a minute or two, I lay back down. Then it happened again. Same kind of knock, same side of the trailer. This time, I stayed upright, paying more attention. There was a short pause, then another knock, still on that same side. It didn't sound random. It wasn't constant like wind would be. It was spaced out like something choosing when to make contact. I swung my legs off the bed and sat there, looking toward the wall where the sound had come from. Then, without warning, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't on that side. It came from the opposite side of the trailer. I turned my head immediately, looking toward the other wall. There was no delay between the two sounds that would make sense for something blowing around the trailer. It had moved. I stood up and stayed quiet, listening carefully. Nothing. The trailer felt smaller than it had earlier. Every small sound from inside seemed louder now. The slight shift of the floor under my feet, the faint creak of the cabinets as the structure settled. I walked slowly toward the trailer door and looked through the small window beside it. I couldn't see much. The outside was dark and the reflection from inside made it hard to see beyond a few feet. I didn't open the door. I stayed there for a few seconds, then stepped back. As soon as I moved away from the door, I heard it again. A knock, back on the first side. I turned immediately. Then, a few seconds later, another knock, other side. At that point, I stopped trying to explain it as wind. There was a pattern to it. It was moving around the trailer. I stood still in the middle of the space, trying to track it. There was a longer pause this time. Then a knock came from near the back corner. Then silence again. Then another knock, closer to the front. It wasn't random. It felt like something was circling the trailer, stopping at different points, making contact, then moving on. I grabbed the flashlight from the table but didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to draw attention to myself if someone was actually outside. For a moment, everything went quiet. No wind, no movement, nothing. Then I heard a sound that was different from the knocking. A faint shift on the ground outside, not on the trailer itself. On the dirt, like a foot pressing down and sliding slightly. That confirmed it for me. There was someone out there. I kept the flashlight off and moved closer to the door again, listening. The sound came again, this time a few feet from the trailer. Then nothing. Then a knock, right next to the door, closer than any of the others. I took a step back without thinking. There was a pause after that one. Longer than before. Then no more knocking, no footsteps, nothing at all. The silence felt different this time. It didn't feel empty. It felt like something was still there, just not making noise anymore. I stood there for a while, waiting. Eventually, I decided I needed to check. I couldn't just sit there all night not knowing. I turned on the flashlight and unlocked the trailer door slowly, keeping my hand on it as I opened it, just enough to step outside. The beam from the flashlight cut across the ground in front of the trailer. Dirt, Rocks, nothing moving. I stepped out and turned in a slow circle, sweeping the light across the area. The ground around the trailer was clear at first glance. No person, no movement. I walked a few steps away from the trailer and turned the light back toward it. That's when I saw it. The ground around the trailer wasn't untouched. There were footprints, not just in one place, all the way around it. Different positions, different angles, forming a rough circle around the trailer. Some of them were deeper than others, like whoever made them had stopped and stood in certain spots longer. Right next to the side where I first heard the knocking, there were a few prints closer together, facing the wall. Near the door, there were more prints positioned directly in front of it. I followed the line of footprints with the flashlight, moving slowly around the trailer. They wrapped all the way around, a full circle. I didn't stay out there long after that. I went back inside, locked the door, and didn't turn the lights off again. I sat on the edge of the bed with the flashlight in my hand, listening for any more movement. Nothing came back. No more knocking. No footsteps. Just silence again. I stayed like that until the sky started to lighten. As soon as there was enough light to see outside without the flashlight, I got up, unlocked the door, and stepped out again. The footprints were still there, clearer now in the daylight. They started a short distance away from the trailer, came up to it, circled it completely, and then led back out toward the open land in the same direction. There were no other tracks, no vehicle marks, no second set of footprints. Just one path in, a full circle around the trailer, and one path back out. I didn't spend any more time there. I got in the truck, hooked the trailer back up as fast as I could, and drove straight back toward the main road. I didn't stop until I was back where there were other cars, other people, somewhere that didn't feel completely exposed. I've parked in remote areas before, and I still do sometimes, but I don't go that far off the road anymore, and I don't stay anywhere where I can't see at least one other set of headlights in the distance. I was camping alone in the middle of nowhere in the Colorado mountains, about 5 miles down a forest trail from the nearest road, in a spot I'd used before, near a small clearing and a stream. There was no cell service once you got past the trail entrance. No cabins, no marked campsites, just a narrow dirt trail that cut through the trees and opened up into a clearing where I usually parked my truck. I got there early in the afternoon, backed the truck into the same spot I always used, and set up a basic campsite a few yards away. Nothing complicated, just a small tent, a cooler, and a folding chair near the edge of the clearing. The truck was running fine when I parked it. No warning lights, no issues, nothing out of the ordinary. I remember that clearly because I had driven a couple hours to get there, and the last stretch of the forest trail was rough enough that I was paying attention to how the truck handled. After setting everything up, I spent a few hours walking along the trail and down toward the stream. It was the kind of place I went to get away from everything. No noise, no people, just trees and the sound of water moving over rocks. By the time I made it back to the campsite, the sun had already dropped behind the trees and the clearing was getting darker. That's when I noticed something felt off. Not in a dramatic way, just small things. The campsite looked the same at first glance. The tent was still where I left it, the cooler was still closed, and nothing looked overturned or obviously disturbed. But the truck was the first thing that caught my attention. It wasn't where I remembered it. It was only off by a little, maybe a few inches, maybe a foot at most. But I had backed it in carefully earlier, lining it up with a patch of flat ground, and now it sat at a slightly different angle. I stood there for a second, trying to decide if I was just remembering it wrong. I walked over to the driver's side and looked inside. Nothing obvious had changed. The keys weren't in the ignition. The dashboard was dark. Everything looked normal. I told myself I must have parked it like that and just didn't remember exactly. Still, I checked the door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it when I left earlier. I opened the door and leaned in, looking around the interior. The seat position looked the same. The center console was closed. My bag was still on the passenger seat. Nothing was missing. I closed the door and stepped back, telling myself I probably just forgot to lock it. It happens. I tried to leave it at that. I went about the rest of my routine, grabbed something to eat, sat in the folding chair, and watched the light fade out of the clearing. But I kept looking at the truck. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift back to it, like I was trying to confirm that it wasn't going to move again. As it got darker, the clearing started to feel smaller. The trees around the edge of the campsite blocked out most of the remaining light, and everything beyond the first few yards turned into a solid shadow. I decided to check the truck one more time before settling in for the night. This time, I walked around it slowly. That's when I noticed the front tire on the passenger side. It wasn't flat, but it didn't look right either. I crouched down and pressed on it. Soft. Not completely deflated, but definitely lower than it should have been. I stood up and looked at it for a second, then walked back to the rear tire on the same side. That one looked fine. I checked the driver's side. Both tires were fine there too, just that one tire. I told myself it could have been a slow leak I hadn't noticed earlier, maybe something sharp on the trail. Still, it didn't sit right. I opened the truck again and reached for the small tool bag I kept under the seat. It had a tire gauge, a small compressor, basic stuff. When I pulled it out, I paused. The bag was unzipped. I always kept it zipped. I didn't remember opening it earlier that day. I stood there for a few seconds, holding the bag, trying to replay everything I'd done since arriving. I couldn't think of any reason I would have opened it. I set the bag on the seat and looked down at the floor of the truck. That's when I noticed something else. The flashlight I kept in the side compartment of the driver's door was sitting on the seat. I hadn't taken it out. I was sure of that. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. It was the same one I always kept there. I hadn't used it since the last trip. I looked back at the unzipped tool bag, then at the tire. At that point, I stopped trying to explain it as coincidence. Someone had been in the truck. I didn't say anything out loud. I just closed the door slowly and stood there in the clearing, listening. The forest was quiet, no movement, no voices, nothing. But it didn't feel empty anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam across the ground around the truck. The dirt in the clearing was uneven, with patches of loose soil and scattered leaves. It took a few seconds before I noticed anything. Then I saw it, a partial footprint near the front of the truck. Not very clear, but enough to see the outline of a shoe pressed into the dirt. I moved the light around more carefully. There were a few more, spaced out, leading from the edge of the clearing toward where the truck was parked. They weren't deep, but they were there. I followed them with the beam until they disappeared near the tree line. I didn't go any closer to the trees. I stayed near the truck. The only thing I could think about at that point was leaving. But the tire. I crouched down again and pressed it. Still soft. Not flat enough to stop the truck completely, but not something I wanted to drive fast on, especially on that narrow forest trail in the dark. I looked back at the open tool bag inside the truck. Then I noticed something that made everything worse. The air compressor. It wasn't where it was supposed to be. There was an empty space in the bag where it should have been. I searched the floor, the seat, under the dashboard. Nothing. It was gone. I stood up slowly, scanning the clearing again. Whoever had been there didn't just open the truck. They took something specific, something I would need to fix the tire. That wasn't random. That was deliberate. I closed the truck door and locked it this time, even though it didn't feel like it mattered anymore. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from the trees. Not far, just past the edge of the clearing. A shift, like a foot moving against dry leaves. I turned the flashlight toward the tree line, holding it steady. The beam didn't reach very far. The trees blocked most of it. I waited. No movement, no sound. But I didn't move closer. I wasn't going to check. I went straight to the driver's side, got in, and started the truck. The engine turned over without a problem. I didn't hesitate. I pulled forward, slowly at first, easing the truck out of the clearing and onto the forest trail. The soft tire made the steering feel off, but it held. I kept the speed low, just enough to keep moving. As I drove, the headlights cut through the trees, lighting up sections of the trail ahead. Every few seconds, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Nothing behind me. Just darkness. I didn't stop. Not for anything. It took longer than usual to get back to the main road because I was driving slower than normal, trying not to damage the tire further. When I finally reached the trail entrance and hit pavement again, I kept going until I found a gas station with lights and people around. I pulled into the lot and got out to check the tire again. It was worse now, almost flat. As I stood there looking at it, I noticed something inside the truck. I leaned in through the driver's side door. The tool bag was still on the seat, but something had changed. The zipper was closed now. I was sure I had left it open. I reached in slowly and opened it. Inside, everything was where it should have been, except for one thing. The air compressor was back, placed neatly in the exact spot it belonged. I stood there for a while, looking at it, trying to make sense of how that could have happened. I hadn't gone back into the bag since leaving the clearing. I hadn't stopped anywhere, and I hadn't put it there. I stayed one night in a farmhouse rental in the middle of nowhere in rural Kansas, surrounded by open fields with no other houses close enough to see from the porch. The nearest town was a little over 30 minutes away, and once I pulled onto the gravel driveway leading up to the farmhouse, I lost cell service completely. There were no streetlights, no nearby roads with traffic, just the house, a small wooden porch, and flat fields stretching out in every direction. I had booked it last minute while driving across the state. I just needed a place to sleep for the night before continuing the trip the next morning. The listing described it as quiet and private, which at the time sounded ideal. When I got there, it was already getting late. The sky was still dim enough to see the outline of the fields, but the sun had dropped low enough that everything was starting to lose detail. The farmhouse itself was old but maintained. One floor, a small living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. The front door opened directly into the living room, and the windows faced out toward the fields on both sides. I brought my bag inside, did a quick check of the place, and locked the front door behind me. There were a couple of lamps inside, but no overhead lights in the main room, so most of the house stayed dim, even with the lights on. I walked out onto the porch once just to get a better look at the area before it got fully dark. From the porch, I could see a long stretch of field directly in front of the house. It looked like farmland, but there were no crops growing at the time, just flat land with patches of dry grass and dirt. That's when I noticed the car. It was parked out in the field, maybe a few hundred yards away from the house. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it belonged to the property or maybe a neighboring farm that I couldn't see from where I was standing. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a vehicle sitting still in the field. I stood there for a few seconds, looking at it, then went back inside and closed the door. I locked it again without really thinking about it. Inside the farmhouse, it felt quiet in a way that was different from other places I'd stayed. There were no background noises at all, no traffic, no neighbors, no distant sounds of anything. I made something small to eat in the kitchen and then sat in the living room for a while, scrolling through my phone even though there was no signal. Every now and then I found myself looking out the front window toward the field. The car was still there, same spot, no lights on, no movement. After a while, I told myself it probably belonged to someone who lived out there or had left it parked for some reason. The distance made it feel less important. Eventually, I got ready for bed. Before going into the bedroom, I checked the front door again and made sure it was locked. Then I checked the windows in the living room and the one in the bedroom. Everything was closed. The bedroom was in the back of the house, facing away from the field. There was one window on the side wall, but from the bed, you couldn't see out into the open land in front of the farmhouse. I turned off the lamp and lay down. For a while, everything was quiet. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint sound from the front of the house. I stayed still, listening. It came again, a light sound, like something shifting outside near the porch. I sat up slightly and looked toward the bedroom doorway. From where I was, I could see part of the hallway leading into the living room. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably the wind. The farmhouse was old, and the wood made small noises as the temperature dropped. I lay back down. A few minutes passed, then I heard it again. This time, it sounded closer to the front door. Not a knock, more like something brushing against it. I sat up again, more alert now. I didn't get out of bed right away. I just listened. The sound didn't repeat. After a while, I got up and walked slowly into the living room. I didn't turn on any additional lights. I went straight to the front window and looked out toward the field. The car was still there, same position, still no lights. I stood there for a few seconds trying to see if anything around it had changed. It hadn't. I checked the front door, still locked. I went back to the bedroom and tried to go to sleep again. This time, it took longer. Every small sound from the house stood out more than before. The floor, the walls, even the faint movement of air through the room. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up again later. This time, I didn't hear anything right away. I just had the feeling that something had changed. I sat up and listened. The house was quiet. Then I heard a sound from outside, a faint movement. Not near the porch this time, closer, on the side of the house near the bedroom window. I stayed completely still. The sound came again, a slow step on dirt, then another. It moved past the window, not stopping, just passing by. I didn't move to look. I stayed in bed, listening. The steps continued along the side of the house, then faded out toward the back. After that, there was nothing. No more sounds. I didn't sleep again after that. I just stayed there, waiting for it to get light outside. When the sun finally started to come up, I got out of bed and went into the living room. The house looked the same. The front door was still locked. I went to the window and looked out toward the field. The car was gone. The spot where it had been was empty. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process it. Then I grabbed my bag and headed outside. The air was cold, and the ground was slightly damp. I stepped off the porch and walked a few feet into the yard. That's when I noticed the tracks. Footprints. They started from the direction of the field, not from the driveway, from the exact area where the car had been parked. The prints moved in a straight line across the field toward the farmhouse. I followed them slowly with my eyes. They came all the way up to the front of the house, right up to the porch. Then they circled along the side, past the front door, past the living room window, along the wall, and then toward the back of the house. I turned and looked at the bedroom window, the same one I had heard the steps near during the night. The footprints were right below it, close enough that whoever made them had been standing directly outside the wall. I didn't look for where the tracks ended. I didn't check the rest of the property. I went back inside, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road with other cars around me. I never contacted the owner of the farmhouse. I never went back. But I kept thinking about that car in the field, how long it had been there, and how long whoever was inside it had been watching the house before getting out. I rented a small cabin in the middle of nowhere in Tennessee for one night, about 20 minutes off the nearest road, with no neighbors, no other buildings, and no cell service once I got close to the property. The directions took me off a paved road onto a narrow gravel road that cut through the woods. After a few miles, the gravel turned into a dirt path with branches hanging low enough to scrape along the sides of the car. The cabin was at the end of that path, sitting alone in a small clearing surrounded by trees. No other cabins, no lights anywhere else, just that one structure in the woods around it. It was a self-check-in rental. The key was inside a lockbox next to the front door. No host, no office, no one around. I remember standing on the small porch for a second before going inside, just looking out at the tree line. It felt quiet in a way that made everything else stand out more, like every movement or sound would carry farther than it should. I unlocked the door, stepped into the cabin, and closed it behind me. The inside was simple. One main room with a bed against the back wall, a small table near the window, and a short hallway that led to a bathroom. There was a single overhead light and one lamp near the bed. I set my bag down on the floor, walked through the cabin once, and checked everything out. The windows were shut, the bathroom was empty, and there was no second exit besides the front door. Out of habit, I locked the door right away. I walked back over and checked it again, making sure the latch was fully set. Then I checked the two windows, pressing on them to make sure they were closed properly. Everything was secure. I didn't plan on staying up long. I had been driving most of the day and just needed a place to sleep before heading out in the morning. I ate something quick, sat at the table for a bit, then changed and got into bed. The cabin felt quiet, but not in a way that immediately bothered me. More like the kind of silence you expect in a place that far out. At some point, I turned off the lamp and lay there in the dark. I remember thinking about how far the cabin was from the main road, and how there wasn't really anything around for miles. Eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the light coming through the window told me it was morning. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I noticed something on the floor. Near the edge of the bed, a few feet from where I was sitting, there was a patch of dried mud. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't a large amount, just a small smear, like someone had stepped in with a dirty shoe and left a partial mark. I looked at it for a few seconds, trying to remember if I had tracked it in the night before. The ground outside had been dry when I arrived. The dirt path wasn't muddy, and I hadn't stepped in anything that would leave a mark like that. Still, I got up and checked the bottom of my shoes. Clean. No dirt, no mud. I looked back at the floor. The mark didn't match where I had walked when I came in. It was closer to the bed, not near the door. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Then I walked toward the front door and checked it. Still locked. The latch was in the same position I had left it. I turned it slightly, just to confirm, then locked it again. Next, I checked the windows. Both were still closed. No signs of anything forced open or disturbed. I went back to the spot on the floor and crouched down, looking at it more closely. It wasn't just a smear. It had a shape, part of a shoe print. Not complete, but enough to see the curve of a sole and part of a tread pattern. It wasn't mine. I stood up slowly and looked around the cabin again. Everything else seemed the same. The table, the chair, my bag on the floor, nothing looked out of place. I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe it had been there before, and I just hadn't noticed it the night before. That was possible. I had come in after dark. Maybe I missed it. I walked toward the bathroom, checking the floor there. Nothing. I checked the hallway. Nothing. When I stepped back into the main room, I stopped. There was another mark. This one was farther from the first, closer to the side of the bed. I hadn't seen it before. It was faint, but it was there. Another partial footprint. This one angled differently. Not coming from the door, not leading toward it. Just there. I didn't move for a few seconds. I just stood there, looking at both marks, trying to understand how they got there. If someone had walked in from the door, the prints would have formed a path. But these didn't. They were in two separate places, with no clear line between them. I looked back at the door again. Still locked. Then I looked at the bed, at the space beside it, at the floor right next to where I had been sleeping. I stepped around the bed slowly and looked down. That's when I saw it, a third mark, closer than the others, right next to the side of the bed, close enough that if I had leaned over during the night, I would have been right above it. I didn't check anything else after that. I didn't look under the bed. I didn't open the bathroom door again. I grabbed my keys from the table, picked up my bag, and went straight to the front door. I unlocked it, opened it, and stepped outside without looking back. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before. Empty, quiet, no one there. I got into the car and started it immediately. As I pulled away from the cabin, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there in the clearing, unchanged. Just a small structure in the middle of the woods. I didn't stop driving until I was back on a paved road with other cars. I didn't report it. I didn't contact the owner. I just left. I've stayed in cabins before, and I probably will again, but I don't stay anywhere that far off the road anymore. And I don't ignore small things on the floor that I don't remember being there. If you also felt like the worst part wasn't the noise, but realizing someone could get that close to you without you knowing, go ahead and like the video, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop your plan in the comments. I'm curious how far you think you'd make it. And if you think this was bad, the next one is worse. Click now to watch 4 disturbing deep woods horror stories. Because in the woods, something can be right there with you, and you'll never know. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.